Did you know that the last true Viking king died on the same day he almost became the King of England? King Harald Hardrada was a Viking king who lived a life straight out of a legend, fighting for power, glory, and revenge. Sadly, things didn't go as well as he wanted in the end. How did he change the course of history, and what really caused his death? Let's dive into the gist of that today. The year 1066 is significant because it was the period when the Anglo-Saxons handed over England to the Norman William of Normandy. Most people can remember the Battle of Hastings, in which William conquered the Anglo-Saxon King Harold, but there was another crucial battle that year, which is not very famous. That was the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And King Harald Hardrada of Norway came to claim the throne of England for himself. Here is the tale of Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking monarch. The Norwegian king of the late 11th century, Harald Sigurdsson, was born 1015, the son of a Norwegian chieftain, Sigurd Styr. Harald grew up during a time when the Vikings were engaged in many battles, and his first significant encounter was the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway had himself been usurped from the throne by Knut the Great in 1029. Olaf tried to take it back, and Harald joined him with 600 men. In 1030, they faced Knut's forces, but Olaf was killed in battle, and his army was utterly defeated. Harald himself was seriously injured, but managed to escape. It was the start of his incredible journey, filled with battles and quests for power. After escaping his dangerous wounds, Harald found shelter with a kind-hearted peasant who helped him to recover, not knowing he was helping a future king. Once he regained his strength, Harald and his companions traveled east to Sweden and sailed from Sweden to the Kievan Rus. When they arrived, King Jaroslav gave Harald and his men a warm reception and made them leaders of the king's defense forces. Harald and his men were welcomed in the house of Jaroslav the Wise. This was not a big shock because Jaroslav had already taken Olaf Haraldsson, half-brother of Harald, the then exiled king. At the time, Olaf's son Magnus the Good was also a guest of Jaroslav in Kiev. With both potential Norwegian kings under his protection, Jaroslav had more freedom to focus on his campaigns in Poland, as Knut the Great, who ruled Denmark and Norway, was less likely to interfere. But Knut and Poland weren't Jaroslav's only worries. Nomadic Pecheneг people in the south were increasingly capturing the lands of the Rus, causing much trouble for Jaroslav. Like so many other kings, Jaroslav's rule heavily depended on mercenaries, as there were few native soldiers. At the time, many of these mercenaries were Scandinavians, and thus Harald was well suited for the job. After several years of service, Harald gained a loyal group of warriors and eventually set his sights on the next step in his journey. With his men at his side, he headed toward Constantinople, eager for new adventures. At this time, Harald and his men were employed by Emperor Michael IV and became part of the Emperor's Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was actually a private bodyguard for the Byzantine emperors. They were heavily armored troops that could pull surprise attacks. Despite their loyalty, they were guilty of one vice. They were merely hired soldiers, and they had a price. For many great actions and conquests, Harald received the title Manglevite, which placed him under the immediate protection of the emperor. However, as the proverb goes, all that is good has to have an end. After Emperor Michael IV died, Empress Zoe married a new ruler, Constantine Monomachus, who became Emperor Constantine IX. Soon after, Harald was accused of embezzling money and thrown into prison by the new emperor. His time in prison didn't last long, though, and in 1042, a palace revolt broke out leading to Harold's release and the blinding of Emperor Constantine. It's unclear what role Harold played in this revolt, but shortly after, he and his men left Byzantium, heading back to the Kievan Rus, free once again. Harold Sigurdsson stayed at the court of Prince Yaroslav again until around 1044 or 1045. During his time there, he kept the wealth he had earned from almost 10 years of military service with the Byzantines safe with the prince. But Harold had bigger plans. He was determined to claim the Norwegian throne. While Harold had gone off to Constantinople to serve the Varangian Guard, Magnus returned to Norway in 1035. At the time, King Knut's successor, Harthacnut, ruled both England and Denmark, but he recognized Magnus as the ruler of Norway. When Harthacnut died in 1042, Magnus also became the King of Denmark. He appointed a man named Svein Estridsson as his viceroy, but Svein soon challenged Magnus's authority and was exiled. Now Harold was back and ready to make his move for power in Norway. His return would lead to a confrontation between uncle and nephew as both sought to rule. Harold met with the exiled Svein Estridsson and formed an alliance with him and the Swedish king Anund Jakob. Together they raided Magnus's kingdom, forcing Magnus to come to terms with Harold in 1046. Instead of fighting, the two agreed to become co-rulers. Harold would control Norway, and in return, he gave Magnus a portion of his wealth. This alliance, however, caused tension between Harold and his former ally, Svein, which would lead to bigger problems later on. Just a year later, Magnus died, leaving Harold as the sole ruler of Norway, but Svein Estridsson inherited the Danish throne, and Harold saw that as an opportunity to expand his power. This sparked a long and bitter conflict between Harold and Svein, with Harold repeatedly trying to take control of Denmark. Because of his harsh tactics and relentless drive to keep his kingdom under control, Harold earned the nickname Harald Hardrada, meaning hard ruler. Despite the fact that Svein Estridsson lost almost all the battles he had with Harald Hardrada, he was still able to remain in power. Finally, they made some sort of compromise, which opened Harold's eyes to other places to conquer. When King Edward the Confessor of England died, Harold saw his opportunity and proceeded to invade England. When King Edward died, people did not understand what should be done or who should take the crown anymore. Thus, Harold Godwinson didn't hesitate to get himself crowned and became the King of England. But his rule was challenged by two powerful men, William the Conqueror of England in the south and Harald Hardrada of Norway in the north. Harold was convinced that he had the right to the English throne, so he decided to fight for it. Tostig, Harold Godwinson's brother, wasn't happy with his brother being king. After being expelled as the Earl of Northumbria, he teamed up with Harald Hardrada, seeing a chance to take the throne. Harold and Tostig launched their invasion in September 1066, with over 300 ships. They moved across the Shetland Isles and the Orkneys and arrived in Northumbria, all prepared for a confrontation with the English armies. In a strange lapse, instead of capturing York, the Danes just pitched their camp at Stamford Bridge after defeating the English forces at Fulford. At the same time, King Harold Godwinson, hearing of the invasion in the north, hastened his forces from southern England. On the way, he recruited more soldiers to join his force. King Harold Godwinson and his army walked 300 kilometers in 4 days. They rested at Tadcaster and were later informed that Harold and Tostig were nearby. Determined to catch them off guard, Harold pushed his troops onward, reaching Stamford Bridge at dawn on September 25th, 1066. The speed of Harold's army took Harold and Tostig by surprise, Some of Harold's men tried to slow the English down on the western side of the river, hoping to give the Norwegians enough time to arm themselves and prepare for battle. These efforts were quickly overwhelmed, except for a single Norse warrior who bravely held the bridge with a giant axe for some time, only to be defeated when an English soldier thrust a spear into his groin. The Norse formed a traditional shield wall, a defensive line of shields. Then the English attacked repeatedly, but the battle lasted for several hours. Last but not least, Harald Sigurdsson, the King of Norway, also met his Waterloo when he was killed by an arrow that was aimed at his throat, which ended his life and ambition to become the King of England. After the death of King Harald Hardrada, King Harald Godwinson tried to make peace with Tostig, but the Norwegian refused. Shortly after, Tostig was killed, and the Norwegian shield wall broke down. Most of the men in Harald's army were either killed by the English soldiers or perished while attempting to ford the river. However, that was not the end of the impact of Harald Hardrada in history, however little it may have been. As soon as the Battle of Stamford Bridge was over, Harald Godwinson received even more terrible news. William the Bastard and his Normans were crossing the Channel. The troops of King Harald were tired, especially after the march in the previous battle, but still they marched to meet this new threat. The two armies fought in the Battle of Hastings, and it was there that King Harald Godwinson was killed, and the Anglo-Saxon rule in England ceased. The English had been left weakened, partly thanks to Harald Hardrada's invasion, so William the Bastard became known as William the Conqueror.